I am stating for the record that my name is Brian Whetstone, and I am here interviewing Reverend Bill Nottage Tacey. And we're in Perkins Library. It is October 12th, 2016, a little bit after 5 p.m. So we'll go ahead and get started. So, just to sort of get some personal background stuff figured out, when and where were you born?
I was born in Osmond, Nebraska in 1949. Osmond is in northeast Nebraska, close to Yankton, South Dakota, a little north of Norfolk.
Okay. And what were your parents' names?
My father's name was Earl, and my mother's name was Elaine. He was a construction worker, and my mother was a nurse.
Okay. And so you grew up in Osborne, or did you move around
Osmond.
at all? Osmond.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, oh yes, absolutely. My family were pioneers in that area.
Oh, really? How far? When did they settle there?
I'm a fourth generation Nebraskan, and my great-grandfather settled in that part of the world in 1882.
Wow.
About the time the college was founded.
Wow, that's amazing. And did you have any siblings growing up?
Oh, yes. My brother, who was in the Navy during the Vietnam War, I had some interesting discussions. And I have an older sister, Cheryl. My brother's name is Jean. And I have a younger sister, Peg, who actually lives just south of town here. So.
All right. And where did you go to school before attending Hastings College? What was sort of your trajectory before?
Osmond Public Schools, District 42R, from kindergarten all the way through high school.
All right.
So just so you know, I was a radical even in high school. I was a president of the senior class and led a sit-down strike in school to get rid of a principal.
Why did you want to get rid of the principal?
Well, he was a thug, for one thing. He was really a bully, and he harmed kids. And when he finally struck one of my friends, he would call me in every day because he knew I was kind of an organizer. And so I got the students together and said, well, tomorrow we're all going to, when the bell rings after homeroom, we're all going in the hallway and sit down strike to get rid of him, and no one moves. He will eventually hit somebody. And when he does, we'll have made our point and he'll be gone. And sure enough, he was predictable enough. He was in such a rage that he had lost control of the school. He smashed a kid in the face and was gone. And one of our teachers who we respected came along and said, well, kids, you've made your point. Now go to the class, and we left. So it was a passive, resistant event. So I had a history before I came here.
Any other memorable things before Hastings College?
Well, of course, Martin Luther King was killed in 1968, which was the year I graduated from high school. In that spring, we were on our sneak day, the day of his funeral. They decided not to cancel it, the sneak day. We were down in Lincoln. And a group of us from my high school class chose to join the African-American students who were standing in silent protest outside of Morrill Hall. And so found ourselves getting jerked out of line by our teachers who threatened us with non-graduation. So it was just an interesting time to be alive.
Yeah. So why did you decide to come to Hastings College, or how did you make that decision?
Well, that decision was made probably around my 8th grade year. My ministers, one of their children had come here, and she had come home. She was in the music department, and had come home and directed our little church choir for a summer. And all those years that I was growing up, we heard about Hastings College because it was our Presbyterian school, so every year there was an offering taken, there was money sent to the school. And so, and then I had a friend who had an aunt and uncle who lived here, and I came down and saw the school and thought it'd be a neat place to go to college.
So you came in as a religion major then?
No, I actually came in as an education major and got here, and within a matter of months decided education really wasn't for me after all. I was taking theology class from Dr. Crosley and decided that probably this was the way I should go.
All right.
So,
yeah.
I was a dual major, history and English.
Okay.
So when I wrote my senior thesis, I had to combine both English and history background to do that.
That's interesting.
90-page paper.
Oh my goodness. What did you write about for 90 pages?
I was tracing a theological theme about the kingdom of God in America, how that theological concept, the city on a hill, permeated through American political thought, social thought, from the time of the Puritans right down to our own time. And so I was picking out pieces of literature and reading through them and tracing that particular thread of thought.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. So you came in 1968, then so you graduated in 72.
Mm-hmm.
So what activities outside of class were you involved in when you were here?
I started out in band, and then almost from the very beginning was part of the chapel group of kids that gathered together. There was a spiritual life committee. I was on the cultural life committee at one point, and in those days we had excuse me, I'm going to see here a moment. We had a week of religious thought, so on and so forth, and I was on that committee. And then there was a committee that was responsible, because chapel was always a religious experience. There were speakers here who was responsible for getting the speakers bureau set up and having people come in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was part of that. I wasn't in student government directly, but was at a lot of the meetings, and as you might guess. When I started out here, I was actually head of the Young Republicans on campus, and then got religion, and so I wasn't part of that for very long. Was a student assistant to some of the English professors, and part of the political activities on campus and all the social stuff primarily.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay. Could you just describe sort of what the social climate on campus was like when you attended here?
well, if you go through the annuals, for instance, you see just a stark dichotomy of things there, because you have the normal college things, all of the frats, the sororities, all the silly games, the stuff that was going on, all of the, you'd think you'd drop down in the middle of the 50s with the kind of environment that was here on that direction. On the other hand, you had a whole group of people who were already beginning to be radicalized by what was going on in the country. There were a lot of new young professors here, which was just wonderful, in the political science department and religion department, English department. I mean, it was just that period. A whole group of them came at one time and created a pretty cohesive faculty.
Mm-hmm.
So you had strong traditionalists on campus, and then you had a group of people who were really pushing for more progressive things happening. And there were real tensions surrounding that. Some of those traditionalist students were not very fond of people who were constantly disrupting them. And so when the moratorium came, there was a huge discussion about whether the school was going to participate or not. And so our participation was primarily teach-in by faculty members. Many of them still held class. Others had seminars, not in their classrooms, but at other places. We had a huge chapel service, which was filled, and Chaplain Messenger was head of that. And I think he got into some difficulty because he sponsored that event. But he had been a pastor and missionary in Thailand, and why he had a different view of Southeast Asia, having lived there, and was really concerned. He had adopted children from Southeast Asia. And so much of his concern was the fact that America at the time was really misreading the culture and society of Southeast Asia, and that in so doing was wreaking a lot of violence on cultures that could have very well been our friends, but ended up not being. So, so there was that element in at the chapel. He was also a strong counselor for students who were seeking to be conscientious objectors. He knew how that system worked and helped guide them through that process. So when the draft began again, he was particularly a busy man, and made some significant enemies both in the town and on the board of trustees at the time.
Oh, really? Like...
Well, I really don't want to end up talking about names, but there were people in the community who were not very happy with him, so he eventually had to leave. But it was an interesting time. I made myself some notes because you can't understand what was going on that led up to the moratorium unless you have a sense of the tensions. Because Nixon had just been elected.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I'd been at a meeting of the Republican Central Committee as an officer in the Teenage Republicans. And at that meeting, Nixon said, when we win this election, and he had no doubt that he would, he said, we're going to change America and no one will recognize it when I'm done with it. And I got chills up and down my spine at that kind of attitude that he was bringing to it.
Good chills or bad chills?
Bad chills. And it was very clear to me that he was going to redirect the Republican Party's base of power from the East and the West Coast to the Southern strategy, the party called it, of co-opting what were old Dixiecrats and take over. And that's the strategy you see the Midwest and South are the primary keepers of the Republican flame, such as it is. And that really bothered me immensely. He was very clear about taking control of the streets again, and that this stuff was not going to be tolerated. But I think he really misjudged how deep the dissent was. I think he thought if he could quell the public demonstrations and get them off the streets, that he could control the country and move them faster in that direction. And I think was quite shocked. And the moratorium was the first and biggest of the shocks for him, because he had made himself out to be a peacemaker. He was going to end the war, bring the troops home, do that honorably, and got caught into the quagmire himself, and could not control the populace at the time. So you think the country may be divided now on the Trump and Hillary stuff, but at that time there was just a real antipathy between people who were for and against the war. We found that before the moratorium, we took a petition that went out. We went door to door in Hastings, and some people were very gracious and received us. We had some kids who got punched in the face.
Are you serious? What?
Of course I'm serious.
Oh my goodness.
And were told to get off their property, and there were a couple of them who were met by shotguns. And so, it was a really tense time, because the petition was a petition to send to the government calling for an end to the war and at least a moratorium for the time for peace to be made. So it was not really well received by lots of folks. Nebraska's always been a pretty conservative state, and that certainly played out as we were going door to door. So that you had those tensions. Mm-hmm. Julian Bond was on campus that year, wonderful speaker. We had John Bodo came for the Religion and Life Week, a theologian from Hungary, and had lived through the Hungarian uprising in 1956, was the chaplain at Macalester College, and had come down. And Dr. Schiffler, the drama prof, had the students do a really radical play called Viet Rock, and we had people walk out of the theater, out of the chapel.
This was during the moratorium, that play?
It was during that same fall. All of
Okay.
this stuff was fermenting. A lot of us came back on campus loaded for bear because of what had happened leading up to that summer. I had to go back and make some notes for myself.
Yeah, that's fine.
Early in April, David Hawks and Sam Brown, who were national organizers with Eugene McCarthy, had called for a moratorium. Jerome Grossman had called for a national strike like Gandhi had proposed. The two of them felt that that wasn't going to work very well, so they decided that a moratorium, a large demonstration, would work better, and there are others like that. In March of that year, Nixon authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia that didn't stay secret for very long, and that really set the country afoot. And aflame. March 20th, the Chicago 8, where it had been part of the Democratic Convention, arrestees were indicted. Jim Morrison held a concert that brought a lot of people together, the Doors, and so there was a rally for decency that he helped organize. 30,000 showed up at that. For the more conservative side of the country, Eisenhower died in 1969 and in March, and Nixon tried to use that as a way of kind of driving a wedge between folks. In April, the Harvard students demonstrated, and there ended up having a police riot, so there was already that confrontation going on. Then in April, the Afro-American Society seized Columbia, and it took over the university, and that was an amazing time. In '69 was the Prague Spring. Dubček was toppled in the Czech Republic, and it was really interesting. Nixon made the comment privately that if the students in America thought the Russians were bad in Czechoslovakia with their tanks, wait to see what he had in store. So there was this building sense of stuff.
Yes.
And in April, instead of reducing the number of troops, he increased the troops to 543,000. At that point, there had been 33,000 of the men and women killed. In May, Hamburger Hill attacks happened. 400 were wounded, and there were huge protests all over the United States with that kind of thing. So you're seeing this whole thing building up.
Yes.
That winter and spring. Then Warren Kimbrough was shot Alex Rochley of the Black Panthers, and Bobby Seale was arrested. And so you have to understand there was a whole question of racism about the war. John Lennon and Yoko Ono recorded their song, Give Peace a Chance. Nixon invited the president of Vietnam to have some conversations with one another. And just as an example of the contrast between the two Americas, at the same time, Old Calcutta was on stage in New York, which was a really radical play of the time. It was the same time the play 1776 about the Founding Fathers was a musical on stage. I mean, that was all happening at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
and the contrast was just unbelievable. The Black Panthers had a terrible split during that period of time, and finally a couple of them sought asylum in Cuba, caused a big stir. There was a huge first gay demonstration in the Stonewall riots that took place in June of that year, and so the whole gay rights movement was happening. The women's rights movement was happening. The whole civil rights thing was continuing to happen. Many people were pointing out that the war was led primarily by the upper classes in America and the lower class boys, and especially blacks, had to go to war and were the ones primarily being killed. So there's a huge discussion about race and class in relationship to war. And many African Americans would not go, including the heavyweight champion of the world at the time, Muhammad Ali, said he wasn't going to go, that this was a racist war. I mean, all of that, okay, was the fuel that just kept burning through that whole summer. In July, Nixon came out with his Nixon Doctrine, was that the Allies in Asia were going to have to defend Asia and not the United States. And people hailed that, saying, well, we're finally going to get out of this. But it was very clear that Nixon really wasn't good for his word. And although he did start withdrawing troops slowly, then My Lai happened in August. And along with that, of course, Northern Ireland is exploding. Okay. In August, a lot of young people went to Woodstock in New York. So you just see all of this stuff is happening in that period of time. I mean, it's just amazing when you think about it.
Yeah.
So that by the time people came back to campus, there's just a whole lot of stuff that had just gone on that had set the stage for some kind of major thing to happen on the campuses across the United States. And by that time, we were right at about 50-50 of the percent of people vote for the war against the war.
Really on campus. So that
and
two Americas, I really like that phrase, really played itself out.
That was the year that I grew my beard, and my father was just furious. He was a VFW member, World War II vet, and suddenly was confronted by this damn hippie that had come home. Which is interesting because my mother's brother, my mother died when I was a boy, but my uncle was much more empathetic. He'd been in World War II as well and had gone all the way from D-Day through the Battle of the Bulge to the Elbe River, so he'd seen the whole European theater of the war. And it was during that time we had this conversation about the U.S. winning the war and losing the ideological battle. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, when I came home, I realized how racist our country really was, even though we had fought against a racist regime. He said, I realized that what happened to the Japanese in this country in the internments was no different than the kinds of things that were happening in Germany, or started Germany. And he says that ideologically, and then he realized our country was beginning to bring Nazi scientists back and using old Nazi leaders as a way of holding off the Soviets. And he said he realized then that he wasn't sure what they'd fought for, and that what was going on in this country were important questions about when do you fight wars and why. And that was a particularly important thing. The college was much more religious in those days, and the Presbyterian Church had always stood for a just war view of things. But that General Assembly that year made the first statement that they would protect Presbyterian students who filed for conscientious objection. Caused a huge uproar in the church. Because the Presbyterian Church was considered America at prayer, it was that kind of institutionalized denomination. So when leadership in the church had shifted its view on these things, that caused a big uproar and actually began the decline of the Presbyterian Church numerically as it lost a base of support. In November, Nixon made his famous speech about the great silent majority of Americans who are good, decent, hardworking people, so on and so forth. So all of that was happening.
How did you stay up to date on all of these progressions during the war and all these sort of cultural events?
They were always before you every night. I mean, Uncle Walter was on every night. And that's who I watched mostly.
And was he a TV?
Walter Cronkite was a great television broadcaster. And when he finally said, when he came out and said this is done, and his colleague Eric Severide both have said that we're done with this. This is a disaster. Everybody in the nation, if you lost Walter, you really had lost the nation's support for this. Ho Chi Minh died in September. So you had all this in before you, and every night, literally every night, there was a report from Vietnam, and you saw the fighting, and you saw the battles, you saw the demonstrations, you saw the riots in our cities, you saw the burnings and all of that stuff. So it's just every day in the newspapers, in all the media, it's everywhere, it's pervasive. The wonderfully intellectual vice president we had at the time, Spiro Agnew, gosh, what an idiot, that he came out with his, these demonstrations are caused by an elite core of infinite snobs, was his term for it, effete snobs rather, and everybody laughed at him. I mean, first of all, that was not language he was used to using. You knew he'd been prompted, so there was just disdain. And of course, it was shortly after that the accusations about his being bought off by people, which later brought him down, came out too. So in October, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that all the schools in America had to be integrated, not just in the South. And Boston blew up. And suddenly you realize that racism wasn't a Southern problem. If Boston blows up, and so, I mean, it really became clear that as long as we were dealing with those Southerners down there, it was perfectly fine to impose the will of the government on them. But when it started happening in our own schools in the North, that was a whole different matter. So it's just a pot boiler of
very tumultuous.
Yeah, it was just amazing. And as you know, uptight and schizophrenic as everything was, it was a wonderful time to be alive. I mean, you just felt like you were at the center of everything that was going on in the world in those days, and part of a genuine movement to see things happen. But Nixon was true to his word, so the billy clubs came out, the dogs came out. And so the empire always strikes back, and it broke big. At the time, we also at the time were doing boycotting of grapes and things here, table grapes, because so many of the students were in favor of Chavez in California. So the La Raza, all of that, I mean, it's just bubbling everywhere. Later on, when I was in seminary, I marched with Chavez and with Dolores Huerta, and I have scars on my legs where the dogs bit me. And so you know, when you're in the front line of these kinds of things, you suddenly realize that the price of principle can be pretty heavy sometimes. So came October 15th, and in many ways what we did here was very, very peaceful. I mean, it was mostly sit-ins, conversations, meeting with people. But the moratorium was so massive in the country that and Nixon was very threatening, so that a second demonstration was called for in November, and that was the huge demonstration in Washington. Over 500 million people, 40,000 marched by Pennsylvania Avenue when it was still open to march down, and Nixon was shocked just at the sheer size of it. It was as large as the civil rights demonstrations in the early 60s, and realized this is tough. So he calls in the head of FBI. He says, I want names. We're going to start rounding these leaders up. And so it became common understanding that if you were at any major demonstration, the likelihood of photographs and names being taken down was happening. And some of us have FBI files.
And you have an FBI file?
And I have an FBI file.
Because of these demonstrations, or?
Just for sheer participation in anti-government activity. My understanding of our government was I was a citizen, okay? And citizens had the right to speak their mind. And none of us, I think, were really advocating, well, I know we're not advocating the overthrow of the government, but we certainly were advocating a major change in government policy and a way of approaching things. But as you know, any institution that feels threatened in its course of actions. Later on, this is a couple of years down the road, a year and a half down the road, there was this major sit-in to end women's hours.
Dr. Gulliver mentioned that.
And I was one of 3 men who were out all night with the women out in front of Taylor Hall in solidarity with the end of this sexist practice. So,
how did that turn out?
If I am correct, and you'll have to find a fact checker on this, what this caused was such a ruckus. Because in locus parentis was in place, the college was in fact the parents of the students who were here, according to the law of the time. And with the women challenging that, and it was not met with great support by the parents primarily. Many of the faculty thought as the students did. And but eventually the case went to court, and Hastings College lost the case, and set precedent for it. So, but it was a part of a larger case. So, amicus, what is the term? Friend of the court briefs. I think Hastings College was part of a number of private colleges that had filed for the right to have a separation of those issues.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
This is probably far more than you wanted.
No, this is perfect. This is excellent.
Just a few more things. November 20th, the Native Americans occupied Alcatraz. And it did for quite some time because there was a law that allowed Native Americans to take over lands abandoned by the federal government. So they took over Alcatraz, right there in the middle of the bay. In November 24th, there was a minor victory. Westmoreland's stepped down as general in Southeast Asia. Nixon's response, of course, was to reinstitute the draft. And so it was by lottery, and that was a terrible night at Bronx Hall. You could hear the groans up and down the hallway of the guys who had low numbers and knew they were going to be leaving college because they stopped the college deferments. If you were drafted, you had to go. And that was one of the ways of tactically trying to end all of this stuff, was to close the colleges down. The Rolling Stones held a concert in December, and that's where one of the major burning of draft cards was done, and then the Hells Angels came in and beat up a lot of the people there, and there were stabbings and deaths. In December, the FBI and police raided the Panther headquarters and killed lots of people. The third round of troop withdrawals happened as a peace gesture. Nixon always tried to make Christmas a nice time for folks, But at the end of December, a huge economic recession set in, and Nixon was having to deal with that too. So the war was less lucrative than it had been. So all of that.
Yes. There's just so much.
It's like stew,
Yeah, exactly. So I enjoy this phrase "two Americas," and I know there was definitely the U.S. certainly had its rhetoric for why we were in the war. What was your understanding of why we were there?
Well, there was such a fear of communism, and I would guess students have no sense of what that was like. When I was a kid growing up and thinking, any time you saw a bomber go over, you were sure it was a Soviet bomber, and we'd all been trained with nuclear bomb training, which is, what to do if the bombs go off in Omaha. And of course, Omaha was a strategic site and the ballistic missiles. So there was a genuine fear that this antagonist in the world was really a major problem, and that it was literally taking over major parts of the world and were a threat to the American way of life. What none of us connected with, because we weren't studious enough to understand, is America took up France's colonial position in Southeast Asia, and they hated the French. They wanted their independence. That was happening throughout the world. The French had been very reluctant to give up their empire. Great Britain was, after the war, did it better in that they realized that they could maintain a commonwealth of nations but allow for independence to take place. So most of their colonies had less of the disruption than the French and the Dutch colonies had. But America took over the gap, and was seen as the chief colonial power for Western capitalism and system. And so all of that was mixed together, and there was a genuine threat. There was the domino theory that if Vietnam fell, then so would Cambodia and Thailand and all of the countries in Southeast Asia would eventually become communist, and people were afraid of that. Most students didn't buy it. They didn't buy the idea, and you had the World War II generation that was feeling that what was going on was the same thing that happened with the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, so on and so forth, and that if you let these people go, they were just going to march all over the place. But they really didn't know Southeast Asia very well. And when we talked to students here on campus who were from Southeast Asia, most of them were just appalled by the policies that we had instituted in there. So you were hearing different stuff coming. But anyway, it was a great time, difficult time.
Yes. So, transitioning into more about the moratorium.
Okay.
It lasted for that entire week of October 15th,
Mm-hmm.
Correct. And I know Dr. Bruce Gulliver was telling me about this. You all get back here on campus
Mm-hmm.
after all of this stuff has been happening throughout the
Mm-hmm.
summer. And so how did you get involved in creating the moratorium or starting it up?
Well, Bruce Gulliver and a group of them, the usual suspects, so you have the names right. John Knapp and Pat Richter, Bruce Gulliver, Larry Bucknell, John Rayside, his sister Mary Beth, Sherry McKenzie, who was a good friend of mine, an African-American woman on campus. All of those folks were already involved, so that the student government at its heart was already beginning to think, how are we going to deal with this? And it was very clear that here on the campus, the idea was we don't want to create an environment of violence or any of that kind of thing, but we do want to get the message out. And how do we do that? And for those of us who are working on the Spiritual Life Committee, the idea was, how do Christians impact this whole conversation about the war and about racism and all of these things? So there was in some ways a much more academic approach to the thing. At first, the faculty was a little reluctant about closing the school down for the day, and when the students came back and said, well, instead of having our regular classes, what about having other seminars letting professors who wanted to have their class do that, and there was any number of them who did, but allowed for a period of time to have conversations about how this all affected their disciplines. And so there was a religious response to it as well. Some of the students, of course, ended up in Lincoln, as I did. I remember my brother calling me, and I said, he was in the National Guard by this time, and I said, well, what happens if things get out of hand? Because that had happened in places. And I said, well, if the governor calls out the National Guard, he said, I'll be there. And I said, and what happens if you see me there? And he says, well, if they tell us to shoot, you'd better be out of the way.
So was there another protest in Lincoln that was going on?
There was a huge protest. I think there were 10,000 on the Capitol steps for the moratorium, one of the days of the moratorium.
So this was during that same week?
Yeah. I knew the governor at the time because he'd been a friend and helped him in his campaign. He was one of the last of the great progressive Republicans in the state. I knew he would not call the guard out unless something really extreme happened. That just wasn't his style. He was a reform governor. He was a good governor. He lasted one term, as most progressives do in the state. But he got a lot done. And I knew Nobby wouldn't. That was not his style. So, so there were a number of us who were there. I always laugh. My kids always, in the Nebraska history book, point out the photograph, and there they see, there's my dad. He was right down there. So, but there were a lot. I mean, from Hastings College were there too. But anyway, so there were a lot of events that took place. We used to have a area in the student union called the Corral, and so there were lots of coffee conversations that were purposely put together for discussion purposes. Hastings the college at the time had a wonderful place called the Gold Room. It was a legendary place where students and faculty could come and just kind of hang out together and have conversations, kind of freewheeling conversations together about everything and anything under the sun. There was a coffee house we had in McCormick, basement McCormick Hall. So that was going on. And of course, the bad Bugle was distributing its information around. There was another, by the way, underground paper called the Buffalo Chip. That was a more statewide kind of paper. Now, that was always fun to read. So there were leaders. I was not in that leadership cadre, and I want you to understand that. But strongly supportive. A lot of stuff at that stage, because I was only a sophomore, was stuff in the background, supporting the leaders, helping them. They would give assignments and so on and so forth. And Bruce was a good friend, and John Leitner and other people like that. Ginny Matthews. Wonderful young people, all were involved working and putting together this thing. And so it was kind of separated out. It was not centralized in that sense, but different groups were doing
different aspects,
different kind of things.
Okay, so so you sort of knew all these people. How did you get roped into, or how did you get involved in helping with the moratorium?
Well, I volunteered. Just what can I do? What do you want me to do? Mm-hmm. So a lot of us were principally out in the community getting the moratorium signatures, which was a big part of the thing. And of course the chapel services, because I was on the spiritual life committee, putting those together and making sure that went off well. Bringing some of the other speakers in and that kind of thing. So just doing the footwork, the grunt work, as we used to call it, the background stuff that would make it happen. so Gulliver and all of those folks could have the limelight, there, and that was terrific. But they'd been working at this much longer than the rest of us, so but you really felt very much a part of what was going on.
I know just from what Dr. Gulliver has told me that a lot of the intention of the moratorium was sort of to spark a conversation and open a dialogue. Do you agree with that? What did you see the moratorium as wanting to accomplish?
Well, I think that for most of us, it was to open the conversation in the state. I mean, most people were so frozen into this, my country right or wrong mentality, that they were unwilling to hear anything other than that. And again, when I look back and I think of what my father and uncle and those people had been through, and they were the leadership cadre, the adult leadership cadre. Many professors here had been in the Second World War. How difficult it must have been for them, to see this sort of thing. It was hard for them to adjust to the idea, some of them, that maybe America might not be doing the right thing. I had been a devotee, and when I was a younger person, when I was doing politics of William Jennings Bryan, and there were some speeches back and forth between himself and Theodore Roosevelt on the question of the kind of imperial nation America should become. They're very insightful. And I disagreed with, as progressive as Teddy was, I really disagreed with. I think Bryan had it exactly right. He said we should be an imperialism of liberty. That the thing that America needs to import and export in the world is the idea of free people making decisions for themselves and not imposing systems and businesses upon them. And those debates are really interesting. I don't think anybody reads that stuff anymore. But there was a time when as America was shaping its idea about who it should be, and where that idea was really challenged. And of course, Bryan lost his position as Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson because he refused to say that we ought to be involved in the First World War. That it was wrong to be involved in that kind of thing. So there, I had done all of that kind of reading in background. Plus, I had a grandmother who had a very cynical view of politics. Her parents came from Europe, and she said, my father used to say, watch out to what the Bullen are going to do, meaning the big shots. It was a low German phrase. They'll want to draft your sons, and they'll take your land, and they'll do whatever they choose to do because they want to run the world and run your lives. And America shouldn't be that kind of place. And my grandmother was in opposition to Wilson and the war, not because they were of German ancestry, but it was just wrong for America to do that. So underpinning for me personally, there was all this other stuff bubbling away. So we were trying to get that kind of dialogue going. What is America's place in the world? By that time, we all knew that FDR and Churchill had signed agreements that America was to take over British Empire responsibilities in the world, and which in fact we did. But the question was, is that what we want to be? I think it's still a question.
Absolutely.
And I think it's the kind of thing that has gotten us into trouble in the Middle East. Besides being gluttons of oil over there, we have imposed ourselves constantly in that environment, beginning with the Brits. People don't understand the Middle East is what it is because they carved it up, and they didn't have. They did the typical colonial thing. We'll carve up the Middle East the way we carved up Africa and make sure tribal lines are divided in such a way that they will be in conflict with one another, because that's what keeps us in power. I mean, the Brits weren't stupid. They were students of Roman history, But the question is that who we want to be as a people and as a nation? I think it's still a central question. Instead, we get the inanity of our debates talking about squat. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Do you see I still have some of the old passion in me?
So did the moratorium accomplish that dialogue?
Yes. Yes and no. Yes, it got people really riled up. I mean, there were lots of people in the community, and Hal Schiffler was the most beloved man. But when Iraq was produced here, I mean, he got terrible telephone calls from people who had been friends of his for years, saying this was an atrocious thing, and he saw a whole new side of people, and he was such a great guy, and it didn't matter that the idea that a college is there to challenge people to think never squares away with people who have kind of a preset notion about how society should be. But it was part of the dialogue, and people in Hastings were talking, and some of them were very nice about it, and some of them weren't. When the Crozier monks joined us, that had an interesting impact on the Catholic community, because suddenly, not only were Catholics on our campus for the first time in significant numbers, but here were the monks who had obviously been corrupted by people on campus, but they were very, very strong in the anti-war
How did they
movement.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the Crozier Monastery was just down the street.
Crozier Park now, yeah.
And of course, we're right in the middle of the great ecumenical dialogues that are going on between Protestants and Catholic that began with Vatican II. So one of the things that we'd been doing during that time was we realized we had a significant number of Catholics on campus whose spiritual life wasn't being fed by our system. Should we not have spiritual guides and directors here? And so some of us went to the monastery and said, would you start sitting in classes? And so we bring those perspectives, and John Crosley and Dr. Walker and people in the religion department were very open to that. So there had already been a dialogue on religious and theological terms. So as they began to think about these things, they began to realize that maybe this is, of course, Roman Catholicism is also shaped by the just war theory of Augustine. And they began to say, no, this isn't a just war. This doesn't fall into those categories. So and a very conservative priest downtown. So there were tensions immediately created in the Catholic community about that. I remember the Sunday in the Episcopal Church, the dean there was very pro-war. And the organist was from Hastings College, and he was a Quaker. And the dean preached this ardent pro-Vietnam sermon. And all of a sudden, they heard the organ desk-like thing roll down. And my Episcopal friends told me about this, and walks into the front of St. Mark, turns to the dean, and he says, this is just crap. I'll not be back. I will not play music for this kind of junk. And left. Wow. Caused quite a stir in town.
Wow.
So and it wasn't polite. I mean, that was Nebraskans and Nebraska nice. You're not being nice to one another. Well, it wasn't a time to be nice. It was a time to speak the truth. And so there was a lot of back and forth conversation. And but by and large, the large majority of the student body was really behind the notion that the war has to come to an end. And so it was draining everything out of the economy. So I think it succeeded in getting the dialogue started. We used to say there was a lot of shouting in families in those days. Kids would come home from school and they'd have shouting matches with their parents. I certainly had my fair share of them. But there was a kind of shouting where you were also listening at the same time. My dad lost his leg in Italy in the Second World War. Well, here's a guy who really paid a fairly high price for the defense of the country. And I finally said to him, Dad, I remember this really directly. Dad, you're the one who told me about how awful it was that we put the Nazi troops in Italy in the front line because you had a general who didn't like them. Okay? And you're the one who said they were good, hard fighters and they were as American as everybody else. Do you not see that as a racist activity? Well, he had to admit that was true. And so we shouted a long time till we got to that point. But his comeback for us, you have not earned the right yet to say the things that you're doing. You have not made the sacrifices necessary. And he was pretty clear about that. So, but he also knew, I was his pacifist son from the beginning. He taught me to box because I was bullied for a while, and my response to the bully was to just let him beat the living daylights out of me, and I'd come home looking like this pulp. And eventually we became best friends. He beat me up so badly one time, I was bleeding so badly, and he just started crying. And I just said to him, why are you doing this? And then I learned how awful his home life was. And his anger this is the way he took out his anger. And he didn't like me because I was so nice. We're still friends. But anyway, Dad decided I needed to learn to box, so we had a boxing match one Saturday night in the house. And when I finally slugged him and hit him right in the nose, because he had egged me on and he started bleeding, he was happy that his son had blooded his nose, and I cried. So, and of course, even then I was reading stuff by Albert Schweitzer and Gandhi and people like that. So I was predisposed to that. We always knew my brother was going into the Navy and into the military and then to the National Guard, because that's all he did was live and breathe ships, planes, and whatever. So I still have a lot of respect for him. We still don't agree on that. And like this coming Thanksgiving, when we get around the table,
oh boy.
We've already made a decision not to talk about how the election turns out, but my two brothers-in-laws, one was a B-52 bomber pilot in Vietnam, and the other one serviced them, and so that, we have folks that were on both sides of those things. So anyway.
Yeah. A few more questions. I'm curious because the Collegians say that there was a multimedia meditation at the chapel, and what did they mean by multimedia meditation?
We had put together. When I say we, the people who had the technical skills to do that, there was a group of singing folk from the music department who were singing things or playing music, and there were images, and then there were voiceovers from famous politicians and people, and scenes from the war. So it was that kind of thing.
And was that well attended?
Well, the chapel was full. Yeah. if you go back to the annual that year, there are pictures of the chapel, and it's full all the way to the front. And that means 4 more rows on either side than there are now, because the stage wasn't that large in those days. But yeah, it was full. There were probably 700, 800 people there.
Wow. And this was open to the community too,
Mm-hmm.
correct? Did you get a lot of community members that came in?
The curious, the ones who were wanting to see what's going on at this college. So there were community people. So it was well attended. It was a very powerful service.
So another component of this, and you've already kind of touched on this, is the petitioning that happened. What was done with those petitions?
That's a good question. I know they were sent to our representatives. How all that happened, I don't know, because that was done by student government. But we collected them. But there was a place where, and there was a central receiving agency for the moratoriums to get this stuff to Washington primarily. But I don't know who. I honestly don't know who handled that end of things.
Yeah. What was the general reaction to the moratorium?
I think there were a lot of people in Hastings who, it was just the students up to their usual shenanigans, was primarily one. But there were significant people who were not happy. And there were some who were supportive, too. I mean, that was going on. It was the one time I was teaching Sunday school down at First Church. And I asked Doc Kessler, I said, you really ought to address this issue. Doc just couldn't bring himself to do that. Now, the same year, in the spring, when we created the Earth Day, we asked Doc to preach on ecology in the Bible and the Earth Day, and he did a splendid job. In fact, so splendid, I still remember 4 or 5 of the points of the sermon. And it wasn't until, I'm trying to remember, if it was in 71, it was close to that. They tell me this, I wasn't here at the time, it was Christmas Eve. Doc preached a sermon that just about ended his ministry earlier. He preached a sermon about the war, and during the normal traditional candlelight service, he had the congregation go out on the front steps of First Pres with their candles and sing "Let There Be Peace on Earth." And there were some members who were really not happy with that. But he was, most of the time they had people down at the church who were for or against that kind of thing. Although Dr. Kingshill, who had been a missionary in Thailand and Southeast Asia, did a forum down there on Southeast Asia and the dynamics there. But it was mostly educational and to try to balance things back and forth that way, as most pastors do if they want to save their lives. But the Congregationalists were much more gung-ho. They were a little more liberal denomination, and so there were many more of them who were supportive, and a goodly number of Methodists as well. And that isn't to say there weren't supporters from First Church. There were, First Pres. But it too, I mean, it caused that same line of conversation. I mean, it split down the center of the American psyche. So.
Yeah. What kind of coverage did the moratorium receive?
There were articles in the Trib, such as they are. The Trib's never been a great newspaper, in my mind at least. We got better coverage from the Grand Island paper, but and there was some stuff on television, on the TV station. In fact, as I recall, now we're trying to reach back in my memory, there were some students who were asked to come on, and I can't remember the name of the program right now, to just talk about the moratorium in kind of a talk show setting out at the station. And then there were camera people who were here there, particularly for the chapel service there. That probably got the biggest press. So.
Yeah. What do you think is the most important thing that needs to be remembered about the moratorium?
What I came away from was a sharpening of the American conscience. The 50s were a fat and sassy and lazy period of time where a lot of complacency about stuff. And I think Americans for the first time had to confront things during that period that we didn't really want to take a look at. Whether it was racism or sexism or any of those kind of things. But again, the question of what do we do with our military might and how do we use it and when, I think were really important questions, still remain important questions because they're not resolved. Mm-hmm. And they haven't resolved themselves. I was thinking, as I was coming to talk to you, that I was thinking, I wonder what a conversation like this would have been like between a Confederate and a Union soldier in 1912, which was about 47 years after the event, how they would look at what happened during that period of time. And I thought, gosh, first of all, it's a long time ago, but so much of this stuff is still present and very real. So, in fact, Janie told my daughter, she says, well, what's Dad doing tonight or this afternoon? And Janie says, oh, he's going to relive his hippy-dippy days.
That transitions nicely into talking about the Bad Bugle, because I know they had some thoughts on what according to what the Collegian reported on and what they reprinted, they were calling some of the students hippies on campus. But what do you remember about the Bad Bugle? What can you tell me about it here on campus?
I don't know how widely circulated it was, first of all. It was, again, something that was kind of underground. And I'm trying to remember. Skip Boyer and Barb Boyer were kind of the instigators behind it. And and I think he was a student editor of the Collegian, or close to one of those positions. I don't remember for sure. Part of this was a lark. And that's the other thing you have to understand. Part of the demonstrations were fun. It was the sheer, we can do this-ness. And the very fact that they could pull this off by printing the underground paper on the college's own press by the icon of Mr. Perkins' press from Perkins Kool-Aid was just itself a coup d'etat. Absolute fun. I mean, it was, do you hear the kind of silly antic that is? And it was great theater. And so the articles were meant to have that kind of edge too, where they were poking at things. And sometimes whimsically, sometimes more direct, but it was that kind of sense of things. There were a couple of professors of English who really loved satire, and the Bad Bugle helped along on that. By the way, John Rayside is still alive. He's just retired from a community paper out in San Francisco. And you might give him a call and see how he's doing. And just he would have some really interesting reminiscences too of that period of time, because he's kept up the whole editorial side of stuff, and especially with the underground papers, he would have much greater connection than I had. But the very fact that these kids had keys to restricted areas of the college it's just in itself kind of an interesting
Have they stolen the keys, or?
No, I wouldn't use the word steal. They knew how to obtain them. Okay, that's the best way.
I understand.
That sounded kind of Nixonian, didn't it?
And so you say you don't know how many were circulated. I think the Collegian threw out a number like 60 maybe were printed. What kind of presence did it have on campus? How many people were aware of it? What did people think of it?
Maybe a fourth of the campus. It circulated basically hand by hand. You know, like in Brock Hall, there may have been 4 or 5 copies in the entire dorm, and then you just kind of passed it down the way, and that's how it kind of circulated around. And I think that's how it got in and out around the campus. Most of the time was just by word of mouth and being handed to one another. So I never remember picking it up at, say, the student union or wherever. It was always something that was surreptitiously handed out through classes and dorms and stuff. So.
All right. I know in the brief little blurb that the Collegian reprinted from the Bad Bugle, the Bad Bugle apparently advised its readers to follow those that were petitioning around town, to follow them around and present an alternate petition that essentially people would sign if they were for the war. Mm-hmm. And I guess, what do you make of that? What do you think of that?
Well, it was this idea, of course, that people who felt differently should be able to express themselves as well. It wasn't that liberals were always right and conservatives were always wrong, or the other way around. For those of us who had real conversations across those lines, this was really important. And I think there was a deeper respect for one another, and an idea that, well, of course, if we petition them, they will petition as well. And so you should expect that kind of thing. And part of that voting was to see whether or not conservatives could get off their butt and actually go out and do something, because at the time they weren't. They were primarily relying upon structures and institutions that could reinforce their own points of view. But yeah, I would guess that was part of it.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Buffalo Chip was another underground newspaper on campus at the time. Were they just another satirical paper? Or?
Buffalo Chip came out of Kearney. It was more serious. I mean, it was dealing with issues within the state, alternative views on death penalty, on, marijuana was a big question at the time about whether it should be legalized, whether it really was a gateway drug. All of that stuff was there. If you understood how to read the code, you could probably find out where the marijuana could be procured. And so it was stuff like that. And then, of course, very serious stuff about Vietnam and about government policy. There were articles about how the military expenditures were draining expenditures for public school and for housing and all of these other things. So there's that kind of stuff in it. So, and then eventually there were early articles on conservation and ecology and the kind of things that industrial agriculture were creating problems. Early articles on ag polluting the water with the ammonia fertilizers that were leaching into the soil and creating problems. So yeah, all of that was there.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned in our email exchange what just other underground newspapers across the country. What can you tell me about those?
Well, almost any major town had one of some type or another. And most of them were printed on, really cheap paper, and they run off on, a lot of them were mimeographed, the old Stettler machines or offset presses, because most of the people who are doing underground papers didn't have access to traditional press stuff, and most of it was circulated by hand. It was, I know that there was a with the buffalo chip, there was a big not a big demonstration, but there were a group of VFW members who made a big show of pulling the buffalo chip out of a newspaper stand. That was the other thing. The fun part was getting into the newspaper stand and putting your newspaper there instead of the World Herald or the Star, and burning them. They obviously were provoked by some of the articles that were in there, but it got some press during that period of time. But there were underground papers. The one we had at seminary was called "So It Goes," after the phrase from Kurt Vonnegut. And it started because the president of the seminary, who I liked very, very much, in fact, I was his student assistant, helped him teach Kierkegaard. For political reasons, made the statement that there were no gay students at San Francisco Seminary. Well, and that there would not be because they were not ordainable. And I was up for chapel the next time around when the trustees were meeting, and I showed up. You have to understand, some of the stuff is theater, So I showed up in my finest frock, ecclesiastical frocks, the whole business thing. And one of the comments I made was, "Why do you think so many people gravitate towards seminary? It's because we get to wear these pretty frocks all the time." Herb Cain had a ball with that. But we wanted them to understand that there were people of other genders and other ways of looking at things that were, and they were there in the seminary. And that was the thing that bothered so many of us, is the untruthfulness of institutions, the inability or unwillingness. Of course, we didn't know about money raising in those days and how people with money tend to withdraw money when they are dealing with people they don't like or ideas they don't like. But at any rate, so It Goes, also printed on the seminary's press in the middle of the night. We had articles there about the war, about Chavez, about all those things that were happening. And from a theological point of view, that traditional theology wasn't willing to tackle. So it was great fun. I'm trying to remember how many articles I wrote for it. By the way, if you're in the Collegian sometime, you might want to look up my column, which is called Pot Shots. The logo was a little a guy riding a camel with this big cannon.
What did you write about in that column?
Just stuff on the campus, kind of fun stuff. Although the one serious column I wrote was about the decision that the trustees were going to make to tear McCormick down. And I wrote an article in the paper about how that building had been used by every student that had ever come through Hastings College, and why is it that we send people on January term to Europe to look at old buildings and then tear ours down? And wouldn't it be a better idea to preserve our own cultural heritage? And it got the attention of the board. And because they thought the students were all gung-ho about the idea of a new building. Doc was not too happy with me, Doc Schiffer, because that was the site he was hoping his new theater would be put on. So, anyway, he always teased me about that. But yeah. But there was a whole idea that there needs to be alternative ideas out there. in college we were constantly told about the marketplace of ideas, but the marketplace seemed fairly small. And so I think a lot of the alternative newspapers were an attempt at enlarging what was available and out there. And it was great to write for them, and it was fun to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yes. I have a few questions just sort of on the tail end and end of the Vietnam War. And once the war was over, did life return to normal? And that's normal in quotation marks. Or were some things permanently changed? What was it like after?
By that time, I was a pastor in Pender. What I noticed in coming back to Nebraska was there was kind of a retrenchment that even with parents who are raising their kids, were raising them in contrast to, we don't want our kids to go off to college and be like those kids who came back and challenge things. So there was a much heavier level of desire to be conformist. And that was pretty tough on some of the kids. I remember having a conversation with one of the young men in my youth fellowship who was gay, who was struggling with, how do I deal with this? And there was just no environment for that conversation with his parents. And I just finally told him, you're going to have to go through every day thinking, this is only high school, this is only Pender, there are other places to live, and there are other people I will find to get him through, because he was suicidal. But there was no one to talk to. And kids who had other ideas found themselves really in a tough place. And a lot of them were kids who were brilliant, had great minds, but they allowed their minds to be conformed for the time until they had an occasion to get out of here. The state has worried about its brain drain for years, but they've never come to confront the idea that the reason so many of our young people leave Nebraska and this part of the Midwest is the fact that the social environment is so narrow. Let's be honest about it. And so, no, I'm not, that's why we have all kinds of expatriate Nebraskans who write wonderful stuff, who paint wonderful stuff, who do all of this stuff away from here. One, there's not a market for it, because no one's going to buy that stuff. And, do you understand?
Yes.
And so our young people leave because the environment is too narrow. So it was really hard going back. I was in the middle of the retrocession bill. Pender was on the reservation. And of course I went to the most liberal seminary that the Presbyterian Church had. And the Congress had just enacted a law that allowed the reservations to be run by the Native Americans themselves. But Pender was really unique in that the Thurston County is divided between the creek that runs there and Native Americans on the eastern side and white folk on the other. And that thing came to a head in the county while I was the pastor there. And it came over a rape of one of the Indian girls, Native American girls, by a couple of the boys from Pender. And there was a huge attempt at squashing all of that information.
Wow.
And then there was a retaliation rape that was done. And those Native American boys got stuck in the old Thurston County jail. White kids went to Wayne County Jail as a brand new jail if they were, whatever crime they committed. They went there. Native Americans went to the old jail built in the 1890s. County sheriff was a Presbyterian. my attorney was a Presbyterian, and I confronted them about the racism of the county and the need to do something about it. And the county was going to blow up, because the lands were supposed to be returned. Well, eventually I asked Simon Lukinock, a Presbyterian pastor, to come down from Pine Ridge to have conversations there by bringing some outside people in to kind of both increase the dialogue but also lower the rhetoric. I got threatening letters from people, and Jenny was very uncomfortable living there. She'd been raised in California. They're good people, behaving badly. Okay. But I remember Nettie Denny, whose father had run for years the trading post. She was in her 90s at the time. And someone said, Mrs. Denny wants to have a conversation with you. And I thought, oh, golly. I never forget, she sat there for a moment. I thought for sure she was going to blast me about Native American white relationships and says, don't you back off. She says, I am a rich woman and I've been made rich by what my father took from Native Americans, and this community is not going to get a damn dime from me.
Wow. Wow.
And she says there's a lot of reparations that have to be paid for what happened in this county. And that gave me the strength to go on. And so eventually it got itself resolved. We got actually what ended up happening is the farmers whose land was going to be taken away and the Native Americans got together and they realized that what had happened is they'd been duped by the federal government. Because the Native Americans had thought they were signing a lease, which they were, but the immigrant families that came who didn't know the language signed papers thinking they were buying the land, when in fact they were buying a lease. And when we proved that, the federal government paid through the nose, because it was a class action suit filed by both parties. So,
wow.
But one of the things seminary taught me was that Christianity can't be a quiescent faith. It has to stand on the side of the outcast, and and not in anger or hatred. One of the lessons I learned from Dorothy Day, I was sitting in the tent getting my leg bandaged up after the dogs had bitten me, and I was sitting there saying, I hate the Gallows, Gallo brothers. Dorothy rapped me on the back of the head. She said, if that's what you think, you leave now. That's not what this is about. What this is about is the day when the Gallows and Cesar and these people can sit together as friends, as equals. But we have a long way to go before we get there. But if you don't keep that in mind, then get out now. And I never have forgotten that. That issues of justice, you can't, if you demonize the other, that's easy. When you realize that the intent of all of this is that someday we can all sit at that table, that's the key.
Absolutely.
You have to be bored by this old man sitting here.
No, this is perfect. This is exactly what I was hoping for. So I know you said your brother was in the National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
How were soldiers treated when they got back from the war?
I'm glad you asked that, because one of the things that I parted company with in the anti-war movement was the treatment of police and the military. There were people who were saying they were for peace, but at the same time were just really had high animosities, to the point of genuine physical animosities towards soldiers and police. And I never felt that way. I felt that police and the military, especially the guys and gals who were in the military, were there, many of them, because they didn't have to be, or they had to be rather. And but more than that, they in their conscience had done what they felt they needed to do. Which is why when I was again in seminary in San Francisco, I often went to the military hospitals to be with people and that kind of thing. To this day, I still work with soldiers and troops who have the issues that come with war, trying to help them get through that. But these people are putting their lives on their line every day, and trying to bring some sense of civility and order in. They're not often recognized for the dangers that they're in. So that was part of the company I parted with in that movement was those who treated soldiers and police badly. And they were, Vietnam soldiers particularly. People spit on them and jeered at them, and many of them were ashamed to wear their uniforms home. That was a sad situation, and why some of them are still very angry about all of that. But I kept seeing my brother. My brother made a conscientious decision to serve his country. His brother decided he would serve as Christ instead. We've had that conversation. And anyway, he asked me one time, does that mean I'm kept out of the pearly gates? And I said, no, but you might have to ask for entrance. So we tease one another back and forth.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, there is that side, we ask soldiers to do atrocious things. I mean, let's be honest, war is atrocious. And then we ask them to come back and act normally. My dad, even after this, when I was a boy, I remember him screaming in the middle of the night, "Get out of the tank, get out of the tank," because his tank was on fire. It blew it right out from under him. He got out. He was one of the fortunate ones. Stepped on a landmine. Blew his leg off. You don't go through that kind of thing. Or my uncle who went through villages where he would get so angry when he would hear people deny the Holocaust, and he was there when they opened the concentration camps. And so, when they've gone through those kind of things, you have to respect that part of their life and humanity.
Yeah. And have your views on the war changed over time since it began?
No. A lot of needless death. And I don't say that very loudly. I never say that around my brother or those who served during that time, but I still believe that all 55,000 or plus who died needlessly. And that's hard to look at. Vietnam is not a friend by any means right now, but it's a peaceable nation. It has done reasonable things for the people there. Many of our soldiers have gone back and have had a lot of healing by going back. But I'm not sure war ever accomplishes much of anything except death and destruction, and primarily for women and children. I see what's going on in the Middle East, and I just see pawns, whether it's in Syria or wherever. And the people who are harmed are the ordinary people who could care less whether America was Christian or Muslim or anything, that just want to have a life to farm and do their business and live peacefully. And that's most of the people in the world. It's people who have big ideas about how to control others and how much wealth they want and how much they want to exploit other people, who are the only ones who support that kind of stuff. I haven't changed my mind.
So what do you think we could have done differently?
I think Nixon had an opportunity as an old Cold Warrior to sit down and do what Ike did and say, I will go to Korea, I will go to Vietnam. And he could have taken the high road. You know, because Eisenhower was the kind of warrior he was, to be able to go to Korea and negotiate some kind of peace, he had an opportunity to do that. Nixon certainly did that with China. He could have done the same thing in Vietnam, but chose not to. Johnson was ill-advised. There's a tragic presidency. Probably one of the greatest men we had in the White House in terms of social policy. I regret some of the things I said about him in those days, but I'll probably have some stripes to bear for that when I get to the pearly gates. But he was ill-advised, and I think partly because people didn't tell him the truth. Too often, when people get around people of power, they don't say the things they should do, that they should in advising them. And sometimes the leader is not willing to hear either. But you know, the most important thing you can do is even if it costs you, is to speak the truth to power. To make sure they understand that there's another way of looking at this, and I think he was ill-advised. And so there could have been another way.
Yeah. I know we've kind of touched on some of these themes, but what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time, the Vietnam era?
Personally, I learned not to be a smart ass. It's the worst approach you could use on people. and there were times, I mean, really, let's be honest, that I said things and did things that probably were part of that whole youth. So I've learned less to do that. You know, I try to keep in mind that people have different points of view. What I want to do is to make sure people come to the table and bring their best to the table. Whether if it's conservative ideology, let's sit down and talk about what do you think you bring that's going to really enhance culture, and what are you trying to preserve or conserve? And do you see any value in some changes? And the same thing with a liberal view, why, or a more progressive view, what do you bring to the table, and why do you see the necessity of change? To me, the grievous thing that's going on is the continued lack of civility in conversation, and certainly exemplified by this election. I've been appalled. I put on Facebook the other night that I've stopped and won't be writing anymore on Facebook. I'm so grieved. And I think the whole country has grieved the sovereign God. I think we have really offended him. And in this way we've treated one another in the conversation we haven't had about things that are really important. And so I'm dressed in black today and will until after the election, not because I'm clergy, but because I'm in mourning. I'm praying deeply. I've committed myself to prayer and fasting between now and the election to try to be one of those who stands against the darkness that really is descending on this country. And it's a terrible darkness of intolerance. And I think that can only be handled spiritually.
So one final question about the war. If you could explain the war in one word, what would that word be, and why would you pick that word?
Well, I'd be troubled between two, but hubris would be the word. Overweening hubris, pride. Greed would be the second one. But hubris primarily, it was an overreaching pride on our part.
Yeah. So, last thing, I'd sort of like you to catch me up to the present. So, you graduate from Hastings College in 1972, and so fill in the gap.
Oh, gee. 42 years of ministry. Golly. Well, got married right out of seminary.
And what year was that?
In 1975. Hauled my poor urban bride off to Pender, Nebraska. I can still hear her saying to her mother the first night she was there with the manse. The house we lived in was right on the edge of town, and she says, "Mom, there are cows staring at me from across the street." She's been a boon companion and a real trooper in all of this. And she's wonderful. We served in Pender for 3 years, and then because I'd gotten a scholarship from seminary, I went back to start my doctoral program. And then went to Oregon for a number of years, where our first son was born. Severely handicapped little boy who lived to be 9 and then passed away. And then lived in a wonderful little Czech community in Nebraska, in Clarkson, for 12 years, where Jeremy lived out most of his life and where he's buried. Because the elders of the church came to me and said, "Well, we don't think you'll stay here forever, but we want him to be with us because he's ours." And they've been wonderful. They take care of his grave and do great, wonderful things. Then went to Norfolk and was there 11 years as senior pastor, and then here to First Church. I mean, that's kind of a short synopsis of all that. But primarily living and breathing people's lives. You know, the church is really about people, and all the heartaches and pains and joys and sorrows people go through, and standing with them and through them has been a real privilege. And to try to present to them something of the feeling of Jesus' presence with them in the midst of that, because for me that's what the faith is. It's not the buildings or the money or the mission or whatever. It's the love of the Savior that people need to know. That has led me to some interesting places. So, my roommate in seminary was gay and died of AIDS and ostracized by his family. And he literally died in my arms. I was there the day he passed away. You can't stand with people and beside them without understanding both the great pain and glory that it is to be human beings in the long pilgrimage of life. And that's been a really holy journey for me. It really has. So
I think that's awesome. And that's all the questions I actually have for you. So, is there anything else you'd like to?
No, I don't. That's a lot.
All right. Well, thank you.